People think the most dangerous moment is when a wife raises her hand against the most feared man in the city. They never imagine the real danger begins after he realizes why she did it. The crystal chandeliers above the grand Lexington ballroom scattered warm light across polished marble, turning every diamond necklace and champagne flute into tiny stars. I should have felt lucky to be there. Instead, every heartbeat reminded me I was standing in a room where every smile hid a calculation and every handshake carried a price. My name is Claire Bennett, and 6 months earlier I had married Dominic Marino, a man the newspapers called a billionaire investor, the business channels praised as a visionary, and everyone with real power quietly avoided disappointing. They never said the other title out loud. They never had to. The silence around his name told the truth better than words ever could. I adjusted the simple silver bracelet my late mother had left me, feeling strangely out of place among women whose gowns probably cost more than my first apartment. I had grown up believing kindness solved problems. Dominic had grown up believing preparation prevented them. Somehow our impossible marriage had survived 6 months of opposite worlds colliding. People assumed I stayed because of money. They never saw the evenings when he silently placed a cup of tea beside me after another exhausting shift at the Children's Rehabilitation Center, or the mornings when he asked if I had slept well before taking calls that could move markets. He carried power like breathing. I carried ordinary routines like armor. That night, the annual Marino Foundation Gala was supposed to celebrate scholarships, hospitals, and children's programs. Cameras flashed every few seconds. Politicians laughed too loudly. Investors discussed numbers that sounded unreal to me. Dominic stood only 20 feet away, wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, calmly greeting guests with the confidence of someone who never questioned whether the room belonged to him. Then something caught my eye. Behind Dominic, reflected faintly in the glass wall overlooking Manhattan, I noticed a man standing far too still near the service entrance. Everyone else moved naturally. He didn't. His gaze never wandered. His right hand stayed hidden inside his jacket. Maybe I would have ignored it on any other night. Maybe another person would have convinced themselves they were imagining things. But years of working with frightened children had taught me something important. Fear has a pattern. And the expression on that man's face wasn't excitement, admiration, or curiosity. It was focus. Everything inside me tightened. I started walking before I realized I had made the decision. My heels clicked sharply across the marble floor as conversations blurred into meaningless noise. Dominic looked toward me with quiet surprise, probably wondering why I was approaching him in the middle of an important conversation. The distance disappeared faster than my thoughts could catch up. I didn't stop. I didn't explain. I lifted my hand and slapped him across the face. The sound cracked through the ballroom like a dropped crystal glass. Every conversation ended. Hundreds of eyes turned toward us. Someone gasped. A senator nearly dropped his champagne. Even the string quartet stopped playing. Dominic didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stared at me with unreadable blue eyes while a faint red mark slowly appeared across his cheek. Around us, security reached instinctively for their earpieces. Several guests quietly stepped backward, convinced they were witnessing the beginning of a disaster. My breathing became painfully loud inside my own ears. I could feel every heartbeat against my ribs. I wondered if I had just destroyed the only peaceful thing either of us had ever built. Then Dominic did something no one expected. Instead of anger, confusion flickered across his face. His eyes shifted past my shoulder toward the enormous glass windows behind him. His expression changed completely. Cold calculation replaced surprise. He looked back at me for only a second before saying four calm words that made the entire room freeze. "Take my wife home." The ride home felt longer than it ever had before. Rain tapped softly against the windows of the black sedan, while the Manhattan skyline disappeared behind ribbons of silver light. No one inside the car spoke. The driver kept his eyes on the road. The security vehicle behind us followed at the exact same distance every few seconds, as if even silence required discipline. I folded my trembling hands together and stared at the wedding ring on my finger, wondering how long it would remain there. Every terrible story I had ever heard about powerful men repeated itself inside my head. I expected questions. I expected accusations. Most of all, I expected Dominic to walk through the front door of the estate and quietly tell me that our marriage had reached its end. Instead, when we arrived, the staff greeted me exactly as they always had. "Mrs. Marino, welcome home." Their voices carried no fear, no curiosity, no hint that the entire city had probably watched the shocking scenes spread across social media before we had even crossed the first bridge out of Manhattan. I stepped into the enormous foyer, removed my heels, and waited. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky while antique clocks echoed through the quiet halls. Finally, the front doors opened. Dominic walked inside without looking at anyone. His tuxedo jacket rested over one shoulder, and the faint mark on his cheek had almost disappeared. He dismissed every member of his security team with a simple nod. Even his personal assistant hesitated before leaving. Soon only the two of us remained beneath the chandelier where we had shared our first dance as husband and wife. I forced myself to meet his eyes. They were calm, almost impossibly calm. That frightened me more than anger would have. He loosened his tie slowly before asking, "Did you see him before I did?" My breath caught. He already knew. There was no accusation in his voice, only a quiet search for the truth. I nodded once. In the reflection. He remained silent for several seconds, then walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens. "The man near the service entrance disappeared exactly 3 seconds after you struck me," he said softly. "The security footage confirms it." I swallowed hard. I thought he was reaching for something. Dominic turned around. "So you embarrassed the most feared man in New York because you believed it would make me move." I looked down at the polished wood floor. I did not have time to explain. For the first time that evening, the corner of his mouth lifted into the smallest smile. It was tired rather than amused. "No, you did not." My shoulders relaxed for the first time since the gala, but only slightly. "Are you angry?" I whispered. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not authority, not calculation, something quieter. "Claire," he said, "if you had wanted to humiliate me, you would have chosen a private room. You chose the one action guaranteed to force every eye toward us." He paused before adding, "You made me change position without saying a single word." The realization settled between us like morning light after a storm. Neither of us mentioned what might have happened otherwise. Neither of us needed to. Dominic reached into his pocket and placed a small silver cuff link on the table between us. A tiny scratch marked its polished surface. "This was recovered beside the ballroom entrance after everyone left," he said. "Someone departed much faster than they planned." I stared at the cuff link without touching it. My heartbeat returned, not because the danger had passed, but because I suddenly understood something even more unsettling. Whoever had been watching us had escaped, and somewhere beyond the walls of our quiet home, they now knew exactly who had interrupted their plan. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the old estate sounded different after the gala, as if the walls themselves had learned a secret they could not share. Dawn arrived hidden behind low gray clouds, washing the gardens in pale light while the fountains outside continued their steady rhythm, completely indifferent to the storm gathering beneath the surface of our lives. I found Dominic already awake in his study. He stood beside the fireplace with a cup of untouched coffee, wearing a charcoal suit despite the early hour. Several security monitors glowed across one wall, each replaying different angles from the ballroom. He did not acknowledge me immediately. Instead, he watched the same 3 seconds over and over again. I stepped closer and finally understood why. The reflection in the glass showed exactly what I had seen. The unknown man remained perfectly still until I crossed the room. The instant my hand struck Dominic's face, Dominic instinctively shifted half a step to his left. At that exact moment, the stranger lowered his hidden hand, turned calmly, and disappeared into the crowd before anyone noticed him. It happened so quickly that I would have missed it completely if the footage had not slowed almost to a stop. Dominic finally spoke without taking his eyes off the screen. He abandoned whatever he intended to do the second I changed position. His voice remained steady, but I could hear something unusual beneath it. Gratitude. That emotion sounded foreign coming from a man who rarely owed anyone anything. You trusted your instincts, he continued quietly. Most people would have convinced themselves they were imagining danger. I wrapped my arms around myself. I was afraid I had embarrassed you. He turned toward me. Claire, I have spent my entire life protecting my reputation. You protected my life instead. The words settled into the room with unexpected weight. Before I could answer, someone knocked softly on the study door. Dominic's chief of security entered carrying a thin black folder. He placed it on the desk without saying a word. Dominic opened it slowly. Inside were photographs, guest lists, floor plans, and a single enlarged image taken from a security camera outside the hotel. The mysterious man had removed his jacket, blended into departing guests, and vanished before local authorities even realized anyone needed to be identified. Nothing, the security chief admitted. No fingerprints, no registration, no confirmed identity. Dominic nodded once. Leave us. When the door closed again, I looked at the photographs scattered across the desk. Does this happen often? I asked. He smiled without humor. People challenge businesses every day. They challenge influence every week. They rarely challenge family. That single word caught my attention more than anything else. Family. Not empire. Not organization. Family. Dominic walked toward the bookshelf and removed a framed wedding photograph. We both looked impossibly relaxed in the picture, laughing beneath strings of white lights on a quiet evening that suddenly felt like another lifetime. When you married me, he said, you inherited attention you never asked for. I lowered my eyes. Then maybe I made your life harder. He shook his head immediately. No. His answer came so quickly that it surprised both of us. He looked back at the photograph before speaking again. For years, everyone around me reacted because they feared me. Last night, someone acted because they cared whether I came home. My throat tightened. Neither of us reached for the other. We simply stood there in the quiet study while rain began tapping gently against the windows again. Then Dominic closed the folder and his expression changed from reflective to focused. Whoever planned last night expected me to investigate business rivals. He slid one photograph toward me, which means they will never expect me to start somewhere else. I studied the unfamiliar face captured in the blurry image. Where will you begin? Dominic's blue eyes remained fixed on the photograph as he answered with unsettling certainty. Inside my own family. The following afternoon I insisted on returning to the Children's Rehabilitation Center, even though every member of Dominic's security team politely suggested I remain at the estate. I needed something familiar. I needed the sound of children laughing in crowded hallways instead of whispered conversations behind closed office doors. The clinic smelled of fresh coffee, crayons, and disinfectant, exactly as it always had. Tiny sneakers squeaked across polished floors while parents thanked therapists for victories most people would never notice. A child speaking a complete sentence. Another tying his shoes alone for the first time. Those moments reminded me that real strength rarely arrived with applause. As I finished helping a little boy complete a puzzle, I noticed a black SUV waiting across the street. It remained there for nearly an hour without moving. My stomach tightened, but before worry could settle in, the vehicle quietly drove away. When my shift ended, Dominic was already waiting outside instead of sending a driver. He leaned against his car wearing a navy suit with the sleeves rolled slightly above his wrists, looking strangely ordinary despite the discreet security detail surrounding the block. He opened the passenger door himself. I thought you had meetings, I said as I climbed inside. I canceled them. His answer came without hesitation. We drove through late afternoon traffic in comfortable silence until he suddenly asked, How many children did you see today? I smiled faintly. 12. He nodded thoughtfully. You remembered every one of their names. I laughed softly. That is my job. He glanced toward me for only a second before returning his attention to the road. No, that is who you are. His words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Back at the estate, I found several photo albums waiting on the library table. Dominic stood beside them with an expression I could not read. "I asked the staff to collect these," he explained. Curious, I opened the first album. Instead of glamorous parties or luxury vacations, the pages held photographs from community fundraisers, hospital visits, school events, and neighborhood festivals. In almost every picture, I was kneeling beside a child, carrying donated supplies, helping elderly volunteers, or smiling beside families whose names I still remembered. Many of the events had taken place years before I ever met Dominic. "Why are you showing me these?" I asked quietly. He rested both hands on the back of a chair before answering. "Because I needed to understand something." He picked up another photograph showing me repainting classrooms alongside local volunteers. "Everyone describes you as kind." He looked directly into my eyes. "I wanted evidence." I blinked in surprise. "You investigated me?" "After our first date." His honesty left no room for offense. "I thought you deserved privacy," I admitted. "You deserved certainty," he replied. He slowly turned another page. There I was helping organize donated winter coats after a snowstorm, my hair completely soaked while laughing with strangers. Dominic smiled almost imperceptibly. "You never knew anyone was watching, were you?" I asked. "No." He shook his head. "The reports were." For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then his smile disappeared. He reached into his jacket and placed another photograph beside the album. Unlike the others, this one had been printed from a security camera only hours earlier. It showed the same black SUV parked across from my clinic that afternoon. My pulse quickened immediately. Someone followed me. Dominic nodded once. "Not just today." He slid a second photograph across the table. Then a third. Different days. Different locations. The same vehicle. The same careful distance. I stared at the dates printed beneath each image. Whoever was watching had started long before the gala. Long before anyone outside that ballroom could have known I had interrupted their plan. Dominic closed the final album gently and spoke with quiet certainty. "Claire, they were never interested in me first." My heart sank before he finished the sentence. "They have been watching you all along." That evening the estate felt quieter than usual, but it was not the peaceful kind of quiet I had grown to appreciate. It was the kind that made every ticking clock sound louder than it should. Dominic spent hours inside his office, meeting with advisors one after another, yet every person who entered left with the same serious expression and no explanation. I tried reading in the library, but my eyes drifted to the rain sliding across the tall windows instead of the pages in my hands. Around 9 o'clock Dominic finally appeared, removed his suit jacket, and sat across from me without saying a word. He looked exhausted in a way I had never seen before, not physically but mentally, as though every answer he uncovered only revealed another question waiting beneath it. After several moments he slid a tablet across the table. "I think you should see this." The screen displayed public business records, charitable organizations, and several investment firms connected through an intricate web of partnerships. At first nothing looked unusual. Then Dominic pointed to one familiar name. The Children's Rehabilitation Center where I worked appeared among the listed properties scheduled for redevelopment over the next year. My heart skipped. "That cannot be right," I whispered. "The clinic is privately operated." Dominic nodded slowly. It was. 3 months ago, the building ownership quietly changed hands through several holding companies. I looked at him in disbelief. Why would anyone care about a small rehabilitation center? He leaned back in his chair. "That is exactly the question I asked." He opened another document showing architectural drawings of neighboring properties. The clinic sat in the center of a massive commercial expansion project worth hundreds of millions of dollars. My chest tightened as the realization settled over me. Families who depended on those therapy rooms could lose everything if the building disappeared. "Nobody told us," I said softly, "because the paperwork was designed to stay invisible until construction was ready to begin." Dominic folded his hands together. Someone expected everyone involved to accept generous relocation offers without asking questions. I looked at the smiling children in a framed photograph beside the bookshelf, remembering every small victory celebrated inside those colorful therapy rooms. The children cannot simply start over somewhere else, I whispered. Many of them need stability. Dominic watched me carefully instead of interrupting. Would you fight for it? He finally asked. I answered without thinking. Every single day. A faint smile crossed his face before disappearing again. I knew you would. His phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen, listened silently to a brief message, and ended the call almost immediately. There was no anger in his expression, only certainty. He stood and walked toward the fireplace before speaking. 3 executives connected to those redevelopment companies resigned within the last hour. I looked up in surprise. All of them. He nodded once. Their attorneys also requested immediate meetings with state regulators tomorrow morning. What happened? I asked. Dominic stared into the fire without answering right away. Sometimes people remember that honesty is less expensive than secrecy. He said nothing more, and I did not ask. I had learned that his influence rarely announced itself with raised voices or dramatic gestures. It moved quietly, like a change in the wind before anyone noticed the weather had shifted. The next morning confirmed it. News stations reported unexpected leadership changes across multiple investment firms. Several redevelopment proposals were officially placed under review. By lunchtime, the director of my rehabilitation center called every employee into the conference room with tears in her eyes. She announced that an anonymous donor had secured funding guaranteeing the clinic would remain open for at least the next 10 years. Applause filled the room while relieved parents embraced one another. Nobody knew who had made it possible. As everyone celebrated, my phone vibrated with a single message from Dominic. Contained only 6 words. Some homes are worth protecting, Claire. The celebration at the rehabilitation center should have made everything feel normal again, but something inside me refused to settle. Parents smiled through relieved tears, children laughed in hallways filled with colorful drawings, and every therapist spoke about the anonymous donation as though it had been a miracle. I smiled with them, yet my thoughts never drifted far from Dominic. I had watched him solve impossible problems without demanding recognition, and somehow that frightened me more than the stories people whispered about his influence. On my drive home, the familiar black SUV appeared again in my rearview mirror. This time it stayed farther back, never speeding up, never falling behind. When I reached the estate, the gates opened before I even touched the brake pedal. Dominic was waiting on the front steps instead of inside the house. The moment I stepped out of my car, he noticed the concern on my face. You saw them again, he said quietly. I nodded. The same vehicle. He looked toward the road beyond the gates before leading me inside without another word. Dinner sat untouched between us. Candlelight reflected across polished silver while rain tapped softly against the windows, but neither of us reached for the food. Finally, Dominic placed a slim folder beside my plate. You deserve to know the truth. I opened it carefully. The first pages contained photographs of the redevelopment companies. The next pages listed financial transfers connecting them to several shell corporations. Then I reached the final page. A familiar surname stopped me cold. Marino. I looked up slowly. Dominic did not look away. The companies are controlled by my cousin, Vincent Marino, he said. He has spent years building influence without attracting attention. I searched his face, hoping I had misunderstood. Your own family? He nodded once. He believes compassion is expensive and loyalty is temporary. My hands tightened around the folder. Then the clinic was never the real objective. No, Dominic answered softly. It was leverage. Silence settled over the room. Suddenly, every strange coincidence from the past few months began fitting together. The anonymous questions about my work. The unfamiliar cars parked near the clinic. The uneasy feeling that someone always seemed to know where I would be. None of it had been random. I closed the folder carefully. They wanted to pressure you through me. Dominic's expression hardened. Not with anger, but with disappointment. They believed protecting business would matter more to me than protecting the person I love. My heart skipped. It was the first time he had spoken those words aloud. There was no dramatic confession, no rehearsed speech, just a quiet truth that sounded almost too simple to carry so much weight. Before I could answer, one of the security officers entered the dining room and stopped respectfully near the doorway. "Sir, the surveillance team confirmed movement near the rehabilitation center again this afternoon." Dominic stood immediately. "Increase security around the staff and families without alarming them." The officer nodded and disappeared. I looked at Dominic in disbelief. "You are protecting everyone there?" He looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Claire, they trusted you with their children. That makes them my responsibility too." Those words lingered in the quiet room long after he walked toward the window overlooking the gardens. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Moonlight reflected across the stone paths where everything appeared calm and untouched. Yet I knew the calm would not last forever. Dominic rested one hand against the glass before speaking without turning around. "Vincent expected me to defend my empire." He slowly faced me, his blue eyes unwavering. "He still does not understand that my greatest weakness has never been my business." His gaze softened just enough to steal my breath. "It has always been you." 3 days passed without another black SUV appearing outside the rehabilitation center. Yet the absence of danger somehow felt more unsettling than its presence. Every morning I expected another surprise waiting just beyond the next corner. Instead, I found ordinary life continuing with remarkable determination. Children practiced new words, parents celebrated tiny victories, and the colorful therapy rooms remained filled with hope because someone had quietly protected them from a future they never knew had almost disappeared. Late Friday afternoon, my phone vibrated while I was organizing art supplies. Dominic had sent only one sentence: "Please come to the foundation tonight." No explanation followed. When I arrived, the Marino Foundation building looked nothing like the glamorous ballroom where everything had begun. The auditorium was filled with teachers, doctors, volunteers, and families attending the annual scholarship ceremony. Children ran between rows of chairs carrying handmade thank you cards, while local musicians tuned their instruments on stage. Dominic stood near the front greeting every guest by name. He looked more relaxed than I had seen him in weeks. As soon as our eyes met, he crossed the room instead of waiting for me to approach. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "I would not have missed it," I answered. Before either of us could say more, one of the board members hurried over carrying several folders. His smile disappeared the moment he noticed Dominic. "Sir, the emergency vote is complete." Dominic accepted the folder and opened it without changing his expression. I watched his eyes move steadily across the page before he closed it again. "It is finished?" he asked. The board member nodded. "Every company connected to the redevelopment proposal has withdrawn voluntarily. Their directors resigned this morning. The foundation has also approved permanent funding for the rehabilitation center." Around us the celebration continued, completely unaware that anything extraordinary had happened. Parents applauded as scholarship recipients walked across the stage. Children laughed while posing for photographs. Nobody realized how many futures had quietly changed during the past week. I looked at Dominic. "You did all of this?" He shook his head gently. "No." His voice remained calm. "People made their own choices after the truth became impossible to ignore." I smiled because I recognized the answer for what it was. He would never ask for credit. A few minutes later, the Master of Ceremonies invited Dominic onto the stage to thank the community partners supporting the foundation. Hundreds of people applauded as he stepped to the podium. He spoke briefly about education, opportunity, and responsibility. Then someone in the audience unexpectedly asked how he decided which causes deserved his attention. The room became completely silent. Dominic looked across the crowd until his eyes found mine near the back row. A faint smile appeared before he answered. "For many years I believed leadership meant protecting what I built. I was wrong." His voice carried effortlessly through the auditorium. "Leadership begins by protecting people who trust you, especially when they cannot protect themselves." The audience applauded warmly, but he had not finished. He looked toward the families seated together in the front rows. Strength is not measured by how much fear a person can create. It is measured by how much peace they leave behind. His gaze returned to me one final time. There is someone in this room who reminded me of that when I had forgotten it myself. I felt my cheeks grow warm as the applause became even louder. After the ceremony ended and the last families drifted into the cool evening air, Dominic and I stood alone beneath the entrance lights. Manhattan shimmered beyond the river while the autumn breeze carried the distant sound of traffic. He reached for my hand with quiet certainty. "Claire," he said softly. "I spent years believing power was my greatest responsibility." His fingers gently closed around mine. "Now I understand something far more important." He looked directly into my eyes, his voice steady and sincere. "No one touches my wife again." The city slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm, but my life never truly did. Weeks passed, and for the first time since our marriage I noticed something I had overlooked from the beginning. Dominic was no longer surrounding himself with walls. He still carried authority into every room, but the distance between us had quietly disappeared. He began driving me to the rehabilitation center whenever his schedule allowed, sometimes waiting outside with nothing more than a cup of coffee while I finished my last appointment. The children knew him only as the quiet man who always remembered their names and somehow managed to bring the exact coloring books they wanted without ever asking. Watching 6-year-olds run toward the person the city feared most felt strangely beautiful. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I finished my final session and found Dominic standing beneath the entrance awning speaking with a young father whose daughter had recently learned to speak her first complete sentence. The man thanked him repeatedly for preserving the clinic. Dominic simply smiled and pointed toward the therapy rooms. "Thank Claire," he said. "She is the reason this place still has a future." I stood frozen beside the doorway because I knew he believed every word. He had never once tried to make himself the hero of the story. On the drive home, I asked the question that had lingered in my mind for days. "Why did you never tell anyone what really happened at the gala?" Dominic kept his eyes on the road while the windshield wipers swept away another wave of rain. "Because people believe whatever fits the story they already want to tell." I looked at him curiously. "And what story is that?" He smiled faintly. "That a powerful man must always be feared." He paused before adding, "I no longer need that story." His answer settled quietly inside me. The newspapers had created endless headlines after the gala. Some claimed I had embarrassed him. Others invented dramatic explanations that had never happened. None of them knew the truth. None of them understood that one impulsive moment had changed not only our marriage but also the direction of his entire life. A few evenings later, Dominic invited me to dinner at a small family-owned Italian restaurant far from the expensive places where business leaders usually gathered. There were no photographers waiting outside, no security standing beside every table, just warm lights, homemade bread, and quiet conversations filling the room. Halfway through dinner, the owner approached us carrying an old photograph. "Mr. Marino," he said with a grateful smile, "I finally wanted to thank you in person." Dominic looked genuinely confused. The elderly man laughed softly. "You helped us refinance this place after my wife became sick. You never let us thank you." Dominic accepted the photograph politely before handing it back. "Your family kept the restaurant alive," he replied. "You earned every customer who walks through your door." As we left later that evening, I slipped my hand into his. "How many people know what you really do?" I asked. He looked up at the stars finally breaking through the clouds above Manhattan. "Very few." I squeezed his hand gently. "Maybe that is enough." He nodded. "The people who matter already know." As we reached the car, my phone vibrated with a news alert. Vincent Marino had officially resigned from every remaining corporate position connected to the family businesses and announced he was leaving New York indefinitely. I showed the message to Dominic. He read it once before quietly locking the screen. There was no celebration in his expression, only relief. "It is over," I whispered. Dominic looked at me with the same calm blue eyes that had met mine across the ballroom weeks earlier. "No," he answered softly. "The fear is over." Then he opened the passenger door for me with the same quiet kindness that had become part of our everyday life. And for the first time since that unforgettable night, I realized the safest place in the entire city had never been the estate or the security team. It had always been beside him. Spring arrived almost without my noticing. The trees surrounding the rehabilitation center filled with fresh green leaves. Children raced across the playground after therapy sessions, and the heavy feeling that had followed me for months finally gave way to something lighter. One Saturday morning, the staff invited families to celebrate the clinic's anniversary. Volunteers painted faces, local musicians played familiar songs, and parents who had once feared losing this place now laughed together beneath colorful banners. I stood near the entrance greeting every child by name when I saw Dominic walking toward us carrying 2 large boxes instead of wearing one of his perfectly tailored jackets. The children spotted him before I did. They ran across the grass with excited smiles, surrounding him before he had taken 3 steps. He laughed quietly while handing out books, puzzles, and art supplies one by one, remembering every favorite color and every birthday we had mentioned over the past several months. Watching him kneel beside children who trusted him without hesitation reminded me how completely his life had changed. No newspaper would ever print that moment. No headline would ever describe the man I knew now. They preferred stories about wealth and influence because kindness was rarely considered breaking news. Later that afternoon, the clinic director invited everyone inside for a short ceremony. She thanked the volunteers, the therapists, and the anonymous supporters who had preserved the center when its future seemed uncertain. Before she finished speaking, she surprised me by asking Dominic and me to stand beside her. The applause that filled the room was warm rather than formal. It sounded like gratitude instead of obligation. I felt my eyes sting as dozens of children waved handmade cards decorated with bright crayons and uneven handwriting. One little girl stepped forward holding a folded piece of paper. She looked at Dominic shyly before placing the drawing into his hands. It showed a tall man wearing a dark suit standing beside a smiling woman surrounded by children. Above us she had written in careful letters, "Heroes help people feel safe." Dominic looked at the drawing for a long moment before carefully folding it and placing it inside his jacket pocket. I knew he would keep it forever. On the drive home, neither of us spoke much. We did not need to. Some days' silence carried more meaning than conversation ever could. As the city skyline appeared ahead, Dominic suddenly turned off the main road and drove toward the overlook where we had watched the sunset during our honeymoon months earlier. The evening sky glowed with shades of gold and deep blue while lights slowly awakened across Manhattan. We stood beside the railing listening to the wind instead of the traffic below. I smiled as I remembered the gala where everything had begun. "Can I tell you something?" I asked softly. Dominic nodded. "That night, after I slapped you, I thought I had ruined both of our lives." He looked at me with the same calm expression that had become my greatest source of peace. "You did the opposite." I laughed quietly. "I still cannot believe that was our beginning." He gently took my hand. "No, Claire." His voice was warm and certain. "That was the moment we finally became husband and wife." I rested my head lightly against his shoulder while the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the skyline. The city below still respected his influence. Boardrooms still listened when he spoke. Powerful people still measured their decisions carefully around his name. But those things no longer defined the man standing beside me. The greatest victory of our story had never been saving a foundation, protecting a clinic, or uncovering hidden betrayals. It was discovering that love could transform strength into compassion without diminishing either one. Looking back now, I understand why that unforgettable night changed everything. He may have ruled the city with quiet authority, but every meaningful choice that followed came from something far simpler. In the end, the strongest promise was never spoken in a ballroom or written into a contract. It was lived every ordinary day afterward. Power can earn obedience, and fear can command silence. But only kindness can build a home where 2 hearts choose each other again and again.